Welcome, my dear listeners, to the chilling realms of tales of the unknown, where shadows whisper secrets and the line between reality and nightmare blurs. I'm your host, Mr. Dark, and tonight I'm taking you deep into a story that will haunt your thoughts long after the lights go out. A plane crash in the remote wilderness, a forest steeped in eerie silence, and survivors who stumble upon something they were never meant to find. A portal to another world, a cursed village, and a price paid in blood. What happens when you cross into a place not meant for the living? And what if that place refuses to let you go? This is the story of Echoes of the Forgotten Woods. Prepare yourself for a tale of survival, sacrifice, and the terrifying question: what would you do to escape a curse older than time? Turn down the lights, settle into the shadows, and let the darkness embrace you. The journey begins. Now. The hum of the engines vibrated through the cabin as the Douglas DC-3 soared through the clear morning sky. Christopher Whitaker adjusted his tie nervously, gazing out of the window at the patchwork of green and gold farmland below. It was 1947, and air travel was still a novelty, especially for someone like Christopher, who usually stuck to the familiarity of trains and cars. This flight, however, was unavoidable. The Whitaker family had made their fortune in mining, and Christopher's father, Henry Whitaker, had insisted he travel to Charleston, West Virginia, to finalize an exclusive deal with a coal company. It was a rare opportunity to expand their reach, and Christopher, eager to prove himself capable, had agreed despite his misgivings about flying. Beside him, a nervous man fidgeted with a rosary. "First time flying?" Christopher asked politely, attempting to break the tension. The man gave a tight-lipped smile. "Yes, and hopefully the last. Name's Edward Bright." "You?" "Christopher Whitaker," he replied with a firm handshake. "What takes you to Charleston?" "Personal matters," Edward said, glancing out the window. His pale complexion betrayed his nerves. Christopher nodded, sensing Edward's reluctance to talk further. He leaned back, letting the drone of the engines fill the silence. The cabin smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polished leather, a hallmark of 1940s luxury air travel. At the back of his mind, Christopher could still hear his wife's voice from earlier that morning. "Are you sure about this, Chris?" Lila had whispered, her blue eyes clouded with worry. "I've been hearing about those crashes in the news. Planes are still so—" "Lila," Christopher had interrupted gently, cupping her face. "It's a short flight. I'll be back before you know it." But even as he reassured her, a faint unease had settled in his chest. 2 hours into the flight, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering a bit of turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The plane jolted violently, causing several passengers to gasp. Edward clutched his rosary tighter, muttering a prayer under his breath. Christopher tried to stay calm, but the unsteady motion stirred a rising panic. "Just turbulence," he murmured to himself. "Nothing unusual." But as the minutes passed, the jolts grew more severe. Overhead compartments rattled, and a stewardess stumbled as she tried to reassure the passengers. Christopher glanced out of the window. Dark clouds had begun to envelop the plane, and the farmland below was now obscured by thick, swirling mist. "Something's not right," Edward whispered, his voice trembling. Before Christopher could respond, the plane gave a stomach-churning lurch. A cacophony of screams erupted as luggage tumbled from the overhead bins. The cabin lights flickered, and the metallic groan of the plane's structure echoed ominously. The captain's voice came again, this time more urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please brace for impact." The next few moments were a blur of chaos. Christopher clung to his seat as the plane descended sharply, the roar of the engines deafening. Edward was gripping his rosary so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Then came the impact. A bone-jarring crash threw Christopher forward against his seatbelt. The sound of metal tearing and glass shattering filled his ears, followed by an eerie silence. For a moment, everything was still. When Christopher opened his eyes, he was surrounded by devastation. The plane had broken apart, its fuselage scattered across a dense forest. Smoke billowed from the wreckage, and the acrid smell of fuel filled the air. "Edward?" Christopher croaked, his throat dry. He turned to see Edward slumped in his seat, blood trickling down his temple. Miraculously, Edward stirred, blinking dazedly. We're alive?" Edward whispered, his voice hoarse. Christopher nodded, his hands shaking as he unbuckled his seatbelt. "We need to get out of here." They stumbled out of the wreckage, the harsh sunlight filtering through the towering trees above. Around them, other passengers were emerging, some clutching wounds, others collapsing in shock. The survivors gathered near the remnants of the plane, their faces pale and drawn. Christopher took stock of their situation. No signs of rescue, no way to call for help. The forest around them was eerily silent, devoid of birdsong or the rustle of animals. "It's too quiet," Edward said, his eyes darting nervously between the trees. Christopher agreed, but kept his thoughts to himself. "We should stay together," he said aloud, addressing the group. "Rescue teams will come looking for us. In the meantime, we need to find water and shelter." A middle-aged woman with a bandaged arm nodded. "There's a stream nearby. I saw it on the way down." As the survivors began to organize, Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to shift and flicker, as if something unseen was moving just out of sight. That night, as the survivors huddled around a makeshift fire, Edward sat beside Christopher, staring into the flames. "Do you feel it?" Edward asked quietly. "Feel what?" "This place. It's wrong. There's something off about it." Christopher wanted to dismiss Edward's fears, but deep down he felt it too, a sense of unease that grew with each passing moment. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden noise from the forest, a faint, high-pitched wail that sent shivers down their spines. The survivors froze, their eyes darting toward the darkness. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Christopher stood, his heart pounding. "Stay here, I'll check it out." Edward grabbed his arm. "Don't, it's not safe." But Christopher shook him off, determined to keep the group calm. Armed with a makeshift torch, he ventured toward the source of the sound. As he pushed through the underbrush, the wail grew louder, more distorted. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Suddenly he stumbled into a small clearing and froze. There, hovering between the trees, was a strange, shimmering mist. It pulsed and flickered, casting an otherworldly glow. "What in God's name?" Christopher whispered, stepping closer. The mist seemed to react to his presence, swirling faster and forming a circular loop. Before Christopher could comprehend what he was seeing, the loop expanded, and an icy gust of wind surged through the clearing, extinguishing his torch. In the pitch darkness, Christopher felt something brush against his arm, a sensation cold as death. He turned and ran, the eerie wail echoing behind him. Christopher burst through the underbrush, his heart pounding against his ribcage as he stumbled back into the makeshift camp. The other survivors looked up, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. "What did you see?" Edward asked, his voice trembling. Christopher hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the forest. "There's something out there, some kind of mist or light. I don't know how to explain it, but it's not natural." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. One of the survivors, a burly mechanic named Tom, scoffed. "Mist? Probably just the crash messing with your head." "It's not just mist," Christopher snapped. "There's something alive in it. Something wrong." Edward stood, clutching his rosary tightly. "We shouldn't stay here. If there's anything unnatural about this place, it's best we move closer to the stream. At least we'll have water and fewer trees around." Reluctantly, the group agreed. With the fire extinguished, they gathered their scant belongings and trudged toward the stream under the dim light of a crescent moon. The stream was shallow but clear, its surface shimmering faintly under the moonlight. The group set up camp nearby, grateful for the open space. Christopher sat on a rock near the water, his gaze fixed on the forest's edge. Edward joined him, his face lined with exhaustion. "Do you think anyone's coming for us?" Christopher shrugged. "They'll send rescue planes, but with how remote this place is, it could take days." Edward nodded grimly. "And if whatever you saw comes back?" Christopher didn't have an answer. Instead, he turned his attention back to the stream, hoping the flowing water might calm his nerves. But the unease returned when he noticed something peculiar. The moonlight seemed to ripple unnaturally across the water, like it was refracted through glass. A faint hum filled the air, low and rhythmic, barely audible over the babble of the stream. "Do you hear that?" Christopher asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward frowned, tilting his head. "What is it?" The hum grew louder. The other survivors noticed it too, their heads swiveling toward the sound. Suddenly, from the opposite bank, the shimmering mist emerged again, swirling in an almost hypnotic dance. "There!" Christopher shouted, pointing. The group recoiled as the mist coalesced into a glowing loop suspended between two ancient, gnarled trees. It pulsed with an eerie golden light, casting long shadows across the clearing. "What in God's name?" Tom muttered, taking a step back. Edward clutched Christopher's arm. "Don't go near it." But Christopher couldn't look away. The loop seemed to beckon him, a siren call that tugged at the edges of his mind. Against Edward's protests, he took a tentative step forward. "Christopher, stop!" Edward hissed, chasing after him. "I just want to see," Christopher said, his voice distant. The loop's glow intensified as he approached, bathing his face in warm light. Reaching out, he hesitated for a moment before brushing his fingertips against the edge of the loop. A jolt of cold shot through him, freezing his breath in his lungs. His vision blurred, and the ground seemed to drop away beneath his feet. In an instant, he was no longer standing by the stream, but tumbling through an endless void of darkness and light. "Christopher!" Edward's voice echoed faintly before being swallowed by the void. When Christopher's senses returned, he found himself sprawled on soft, mossy ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, and a faint golden light filtered through the dense canopy above. He sat up, disoriented. The stream, the survivors, the wreckage, they were gone. Instead, he was surrounded by towering trees unlike anything he'd ever seen. Their trunks were gnarled and twisted, their bark a deep, iridescent black that shimmered like obsidian. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the heavy stillness. The hum was still there, more distinct now, resonating from deeper within the forest. Despite his fear, something compelled him to follow it. He pushed through the underbrush, each step filling him with both dread and curiosity. After what felt like hours, he emerged into a clearing. In its center stood a small village of crude wooden huts, their roofs thatched with dried grass. The villagers, pale, gaunt figures dressed in primitive clothing, paused their activities to stare at him. Christopher froze under their scrutinizing gaze. "Hello?" he called hesitantly. A tall man stepped forward, his grey beard hanging past his chest. He carried a staff carved with intricate patterns and stared at Christopher with piercing, colorless eyes. "You're not from here?" the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Christopher nodded, his throat dry. My plane crashed. I don't know how I got here. The man exchanged a glance with the villagers, who murmured amongst themselves. Finally, he motioned for Christopher to follow him. Back at the stream, Edward paced anxiously as the mist began to fade. He's gone, he muttered, panic rising in his chest. Tom gripped his shoulder. We need to stay away from that thing. But Edward shook him off. If you're too scared, fine. I'm going after him. Before anyone could stop him, Edward ran toward the loop. The glow reignited as he approached, and without hesitation, he stepped through. The cold hit him like a wave, but he pushed forward. When he emerged on the other side, he found himself in the same strange forest, the hum guiding him toward the village. "Christopher!" he called, his voice echoing through the trees. A figure appeared from the shadows, one of the villagers. Edward froze as the pale man approached, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice like a whisper carried on the wind. "I'm looking for my friend," Edward said, his voice shaking. "Have you seen him?" The man tilted his head, considering Edward for a moment before gesturing for him to follow. Reunited in the village, Christopher and Edward exchanged hurried whispers about their predicament. "These people, there's something off about them," Edward said. "I know," Christopher replied, glancing at the villagers. "But they might be our only way out." As night fell, the villagers lit torches around the clearing, casting flickering shadows on the huts. The bearded man, whom the others called Ezekiel, approached the pair. "You must stay inside tonight," Ezekiel warned. "This forest is not safe after dark." Christopher frowned. "Why? What's out there?" Ezekiel's expression darkened. "It is not the forest you need to fear." Before they could question him further, he turned and walked away, leaving them alone in a small hut. As the torches burned low and the forest grew silent, Christopher and Edward huddled in the darkness, their unease growing with each passing moment. Outside, a faint sound reached their ears, a chorus of bone-chilling wails that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. Edward turned to Christopher, his face pale. What did he mean? "It's not the forest we need to fear." Christopher didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down, he already knew. Christopher and Edward sat in the dimly lit hut, their backs pressed against the rough wooden walls. The faint wails outside had grown louder, evolving into a bone-rattling cacophony that seemed to come from every direction. The light of the torches outside flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced like spectres on the walls. Edward clutched his rosary, muttering prayers under his breath. "This place, it's not right. I can feel it." Christopher remained silent, his eyes fixed on the door. His pulse quickened with every passing second, his mind replaying Ezekiel's warning, "It's not the forest you need to fear." Suddenly, the wailing stopped. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like the world had been plunged into a void. "I don't like this," Edward whispered. Before Christopher could respond, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Ezekiel, his expression grim. "Come," he said. "You need to see something." Ezekiel led them to the center of the village, where the rest of the villagers had gathered around a massive fire. The flames roared high, illuminating their pale faces and hollow eyes. Christopher and Edward exchanged uneasy glances as they joined the circle. In the flickering firelight, the villagers looked almost skeletal, their skin stretched taut over angular bones. "What's going on?" Christopher asked. Ezekiel raised a hand, silencing him. "You have crossed into a place not meant for the living. This village exists on the border between worlds, caught in a curse that binds us to this forest." Edward's brow furrowed. "What kind of curse?" Ezekiel's voice was low, filled with a heavy sorrow. Centuries ago, this was a thriving settlement. Our ancestors lived in harmony with the forest, taking only what they needed. But one fateful day, a wandering preacher came to our village. He spoke of redemption, of a world beyond the forest. Some of us were intrigued, but others were afraid of change. Ezekiel paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. The preacher was murdered, beaten to death by those who feared his message. As he lay dying, he cursed us. He called upon forces older than time, binding us to this place and condemning us to an existence between life and death. By day we are as you see us now, but when night falls... The villagers lowered their heads in unison, as though ashamed. Ezekiel continued, "The curse consumes us. We become skeletal husks, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh and blood. It is a punishment that will only end when the curse is lifted, or when the last of us is gone." Edward took a step back, his face pale. "You mean to tell us that you eat people?" Ezekiel nodded solemnly. "We have no choice. The hunger is relentless, but we do not take pleasure in it. It is our shame, our torment." Christopher's stomach churned. "Then why bring us here? Were we just another meal to you?" Before Ezekiel could answer, a young woman stepped forward. Her auburn hair glowed in the firelight, and her green eyes shimmered with defiance. "My name is Ruth," she said. "Not all of us agree with the ways of this village. I've tried to stop them, but the hunger is too strong for most." Ezekiel glared at her. "Ruth, enough." "Ruth, no, they need to know the truth," Ruth snapped. She turned to Christopher and Edward. "You were brought here because you're outsiders. The curse requires us to feed on those who do not belong to the forest. It's how we survive. But there are others who have tried to escape this place, others who were hunted down and killed." Edward's voice cracked with panic. "We need to get out of here, now." Ezekiel sighed heavily. "You cannot leave. The forest will not let you. The portal you came through, it only works in one direction. Those who try to go back are lost forever." Christopher's fists clenched. "There has to be a way. You can't expect us to just accept this." Ruth stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There might be a way. The curse could be broken, but it would require something none of us have dared to do. Contact the spirits of the forest and ask for their forgiveness." Ezekiel scoffed. "You know as well as I do that the spirits do not forgive. They are as bound to this curse as we are." "But we've never tried," Ruth countered. "We've spent centuries wallowing in despair, feeding on innocent lives. Isn't it worth the risk to end this once and for all?" Edward grabbed Christopher's arm. "This is madness. We shouldn't get involved in their problems. We need to focus on finding another way out." Christopher hesitated. Ruth's words stirred something in him, a faint glimmer of hope amidst the despair. "What do we need to do?" Ruth's expression softened. "There is a grove deep within the forest where the preacher's spirit lingers. If we can reach it and offer a sincere plea for forgiveness, there's a chance the curse could be lifted." "And if it doesn't work?" Edward asked. Ruth's face darkened. "Then the forest will claim us all." As the fire died down, the villagers dispersed, retreating to their huts. Ezekiel warned Christopher and Edward to stay indoors, but sleep was impossible. The howls and wails of the cursed villagers echoed through the night, a chilling reminder of the danger that surrounded them. Christopher lay on the cold, hard floor, his mind racing. "Do you believe her?" he asked. Edward sat against the wall, his hands trembling. "I don't know what to believe anymore. But if she's right, it might be our only shot." Hours passed like an eternity. The wails outside grew louder, accompanied by the sound of bones rattling against the wooden walls. Then came the knock. Both men froze, their breath caught in their throats. "Who is it?" Christopher whispered. The door creaked open, revealing Ruth. Her face was pale, her expression urgent. "We need to leave, now." Ruth led them out of the hut, guiding them through the shadows of the village. The skeletal forms of the cursed villagers roamed the clearing, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Stay quiet," Ruth whispered. "They won't attack if they don't notice us." Edward clutched Christopher's arm, his knuckles white. Together, they followed Ruth toward the edge of the village, their every step muffled by the moss-covered ground. But as they reached the tree line, a guttural growl shattered the silence. One of the skeletal figures turned, its glowing eyes locking onto them. "Run!" Ruth hissed. The three of them sprinted into the forest, the skeletal villagers in pursuit. The sound of snapping twigs and rattling bones echoed behind them as they weaved through the dense trees, the cursed forms closing in. The forest seemed alive, its gnarled branches clawing at Christopher, Edward, and Ruth as they ran. The glowing eyes of the skeletal villagers cut through the darkness behind them, accompanied by the relentless clatter of bone on bone. "Keep running!" Ruth yelled, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. Christopher's lungs burned, but he forced his legs to keep moving. Beside him, Edward stumbled on a root, barely catching himself before falling. "They're getting closer!" Edward gasped. Ruth darted ahead, her movements nimble and precise. She led them toward a faint golden light flickering in the distance. "The grove is up ahead!" she shouted. Christopher's heart pounded with a mixture of terror and hope. Could this grove truly hold the key to ending the nightmare? The trio burst into the grove, a circular clearing surrounded by ancient towering trees. At its center stood a weathered stone altar, covered in moss and faintly glowing with the same golden light as the portal. The air here was heavy, charged with an energy that made Christopher's skin prickle. The hum he'd heard earlier now filled the grove, a deep and resonant sound that seemed to emanate from the altar itself. Ruth spun around, her expression urgent. "Place your hands on the altar. Focus your thoughts on seeking forgiveness. It's our only chance." Edward hesitated, his gaze darting to the forest's edge, where skeletal figures were beginning to emerge. Their hollow eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and their twisted forms moved with unnatural speed. "They're coming!" Edward cried. "Do it now!" Ruth screamed. Christopher rushed to the altar, slamming his hands onto its cold stone surface. Edward followed, his rosary dangling from his trembling fingers. As soon as their hands touched the altar, the golden light flared, illuminating the entire grove. The hum grew into a deafening roar, and a gust of wind erupted from the altar, forcing the skeletal villagers to halt at the grove's edge. The air shimmered, and a ghostly figure materialized above the altar. It was the preacher, his translucent form draped in tattered robes. His face was gaunt but serene, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Who dares disturb this sacred ground?" the preacher's voice boomed, echoing through the grove. Ruth fell to her knees. "Great Spirit, please hear our plea. These outsiders mean no harm. They are victims of our curse. We beg you to end this torment." The preacher turned his piercing gaze toward Christopher and Edward. "And you? Why have you come to this forsaken place?" Christopher's voice shook as he spoke. "We didn't mean to come here. We were brought through your portal by accident. Please, we just want to go home." The preacher's expression darkened. "Home, do you not see? Your kind has no place here. This land was never meant for outsiders." Edward gripped his rosary tighter. "Please, we didn't choose this. We don't deserve to die for something we didn't do." For a moment the preacher was silent, his glowing form flickering like a candle in the wind. Finally, he raised his hands. "The curse was cast to punish the wicked, yet its shadow has grown too long. You have brought light into the darkness. Perhaps there is still hope." The preacher's form expanded, enveloping the entire grove in golden light. The skeletal villagers writhed at the edge of the clearing, their forms flickering as if caught between realities. "To lift the curse," the preacher intoned, "a sacrifice must be made, a life for a life. Will any among you offer themselves?" Christopher's stomach dropped. He glanced at Edward, whose face was pale with terror, then at Ruth, who stared at the preacher with a mix of resolve and fear. "I'll do it," Ruth said, stepping forward. "No," Christopher grabbed her arm. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Ruth replied, her voice steady. "This curse has taken everything from me. If my life can end it, then it's a small price to pay." Before Christopher could argue, Ruth placed her hands on the altar. The golden light engulfed her, and she let out a sharp gasp. Her body began to dissolve into shimmering particles, which flowed into the altar and then radiated outward in a blinding wave. The grove trembled as the wave of light spread through the forest. The skeletal villagers let out inhuman wails as their forms disintegrated, leaving only faint wisps of smoke. The hum ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of the curse lifted. Christopher and Edward stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the altar. Ruth was gone, her sacrifice leaving no trace but the faint glow of the moss-covered stone. The preacher's form reappeared, his expression softening. "Her sacrifice has restored balance. The portal will now lead you home. Go, and remember what you have seen here." The golden light faded, and the grove returned to darkness. Christopher and Edward stumbled out of the grove, their legs weak, but their resolve strong. They retraced their steps through the forest, the oppressive shadows now replaced by a tranquil stillness. When they reached the portal, it shimmered faintly, no longer the menacing force it once was. "Do you think it's safe?" Edward asked, his voice trembling. Christopher nodded. "It has to be. We don't have another choice." Taking a deep breath, they stepped through the portal together. When Christopher opened his eyes, he was lying on a hospital bed. The harsh fluorescent lights and sterile smell of antiseptic were a stark contrast to the forest's earthy darkness. A nurse leaned over him, her face lined with concern. "You're lucky to be alive. A rescue team found you near the wreckage. You were delirious, rambling about skeletons and a portal." Christopher glanced around the room. Edward was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the other man, Edward Bright?" Christopher asked. The nurse frowned. "You were the only survivor we found." Christopher's heart sank as memories of the cursed village flooded back. Had Edward been lost to the portal, or had something else claimed him? As he stared out the window, the golden glow of the sunset cast long shadows across the room. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the distance, a woman with auburn hair and green eyes, but when he blinked, she was gone. Christopher sat in the hospital bed, his body sore, and his mind a whirlwind of fragmented memories. The nurse had left him alone after tending to his wounds, but her words lingered. "You were the only survivor." He couldn't believe it. Edward had been with him the entire time. They had escaped together, hadn't they? The antiseptic air felt oppressive, the fluorescent lights too harsh. Christopher rubbed his temples, trying to piece together the events in the cursed forest. His thoughts were interrupted when the door creaked open and a man in a dark suit entered. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said, his tone measured. "I'm Agent Doyle with the Federal Aviation Agency. I need to ask you a few questions about the crash." Christopher nodded, though his mouth was dry. "Of course." Doyle pulled up a chair and opened a leather-bound notebook. "According to our records, your plane went down in the Appalachian wilderness nearly 2 weeks ago. Rescue teams found the wreckage but reported no other survivors. Can you tell us what happened after the crash?" Christopher hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. Could he even explain what he'd seen? The skeletal villagers, the cursed grove, Ruth's sacrifice. It all sounded like the ramblings of a madman. There was a forest, Christopher began slowly. After the crash, we tried to survive, but something about the place wasn't right. It was too quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Doyle's pen scratched against the paper as Christopher spoke. We found a portal, Christopher continued, his voice trembling. It took us to another part of the forest, a place where time and reality felt twisted. There was a village, and the people there. They weren't entirely human. They were cursed. Doyle's pen paused mid-sentence. He glanced up, his expression neutral. Cursed? Christopher nodded. They became skeletal creatures at night, driven by hunger. They lured travelers like us to their village. We barely escaped. For the first time, Doyle's stoic demeanor faltered. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned forward. And this portal, where exactly did you find it? Christopher shook his head. I don't know. It felt like the forest itself led us there. Doyle stared at him for a moment, then closed his notebook. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. That will be all for now. As Doyle stood to leave, Christopher couldn't resist asking, Do you believe me? Doyle's lips twitched into a faint smile. Let's just say, I've heard stranger things. Days turned into weeks, and Christopher was discharged from the hospital. Though he returned to his home in Chicago, life felt different, hollow, like a part of him had been left behind in the forest. His wife, Lila, embraced him tightly when he walked through the door, her eyes filled with tears. I thought I'd lost you, she whispered. Christopher held her close, but he couldn't bring himself to share the full story. How could he make her understand? The forest had left its mark on him, an invisible scar that no one else could see. Christopher spent countless nights wondering about Edward. Had he truly been lost in the portal, or had something else happened? He searched newspapers and government reports for any mention of additional survivors, but there was nothing. One evening, as he sifted through old records, a letter arrived at his door. The envelope was plain, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. I'm still here. Christopher's hands trembled as he read the note. He recognized the handwriting. It was Edward's. But how? Where was he? Before he could process the letter, a faint hum filled the room. It was the same sound he had heard in the grove. Christopher's breath hitched as a golden glow flickered in the corner of his study. He turned slowly, his heart pounding. There, just beyond the edge of the room, was the portal. Christopher approached the glowing loop, his mind racing. Was it real, or a hallucination? If Edward was truly alive, trapped in that cursed forest, did Christopher have the courage to go back? He reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed against the edge of the portal. The icy jolt was the same as before, sending a shiver down his spine. Lila's voice echoed from the hallway. Chris, are you all right? Christopher froze, his hand hovering in the air. He turned back toward the portal, then to the door where Lila's silhouette appeared. Yeah, he said, his voice shaky. I'm fine. The portal pulsed once, then faded, leaving nothing but the faint scent of moss and earth. Christopher sank into his chair, clutching the letter. He didn't know if he'd ever see Edward again, or if he could bring himself to face the forest a second time. But one thing was certain, the forest wasn't done with him yet.